Thank you very much. Thank you, Fred. As always, you make my introduction much more succinctly and clearly than I do, and I appreciate you covering most of my main points in my presentation.
Okay, well, you can sit down.
I'm about to. But before I sit down, I think it's important to first thank Matt Adler and Claire Brunel, who were part of our team when we first started working on this project a year ago, and who co-authored the Institute working paper on the Doha Round, from which this book substantially draws, and which was the foundation for our revised efforts over the past months. So many thanks to Matt and Claire. Now, my colleagues and I undertook this analysis because of our profound concern about the implications for the multilateral trading system of continued drift in the Doha Round. And I'm sure Carlo and others will have more to say about this later. And as Fred noted, we hope our study will help better inform options for moving forward in the WTO negotiations, and equally important, propel the political will to do so, because that certainly has been lacking. Now, clearly the Doha Round is in distress. It's been going on for so long, almost 9 years now, that many of the participants have begun to believe their own rhetoric about why the round is at an impasse, and this is known as the Geneva blame game, and what certain countries should do or should be excused from doing to allow the trade deal to close. Some believe that what is already on the table is largely sufficient. Others argue that the cause is already lost and that the talks should be abandoned or substantially recast. And that's the reason why we are so concerned about this. We did the analysis to put these views to the test, and we find that both the super optimists and the super pessimists are wrong. With the help of a comprehensive data set that we got from the WTO, we calculated the impact of applying the substantially agreed agriculture and non-agricultural market access, the NAMA formulas, for a sample of 22 participating countries in the Doha Round. And those countries account for about 88% of global GDP and about 3/4 of world trade. And then we sized up the results to estimate the global impact of what is on the table and what could be included in the Doha package. We report both the trade and GDP gains for major trading countries as well as for the group as a whole. And then we top up the results by estimating the value that would accrue from additional reforms in specific NAMA sectors, in services, and in trade facilitation. And what we find is that the liberalization commitments already on the table, and Gary Hufbauer will shortly go into the details on each sector, but those commitments on the table to cut the tariffs and the subsidies in agriculture and non-agricultural market access are significant, but they're insufficient. The current package is neither ambitious enough or balanced enough to garner political support in major economies. Recent studies by the World Bank come to similar conclusions, though they differ with us somewhat on the relative size and the distribution of the gains. But the key is that what is on the table is not insignificant, but not sufficient to garner and the political or coalesce the political forces necessary to make changes in existing policies. And that's what really we mean when we say not ambitious enough. We mean not enough on offer to ensure that countries will liberalize existing policies and practices in exchange for what is on offer from other countries in the Doha Round. And by not balanced enough, we mean not enough progress across the entire Doha agenda to ensure political support, and not enough for both developed and developing countries to justify the title of the exercise as a development round and to meet the development round goals. Now let me skip ahead just briefly to the overview of the benefits, what's on the table. And this slide shows you why many people are saying there's not that much on the table. In fact, Ron Kirk cites already quite frequently our own number for the export gains for the United States from what is on the table in agriculture and NAMA. And he says it's only $7.6 billion, and therefore not enough to justify 10 years of effort. Indeed, the U.S. results are modest on agriculture and NAMA. We believe you should look at both the export side and the import side. But still, if you look at it, it is relatively small. There's nothing on services, which to date have not, whose negotiations have not progressed very far at all. So you can see that these results make it very difficult to get interest groups, political constituencies excited about spending political capital to push the Doha Round. And so we look at this, and as the numbers on NAMA, which Gary will point out later, will clearly show, it shows something that we didn't think of at the beginning. We thought on NAMA, when Frank Vargo complained all the times at all our meetings that the round was not producing enough for U.S. business, we thought, well, he's just pushing his constituent interests. And we had to come to the conclusion that, my God, Frank Vargo was right. It's hard to admit that in public, but there does need to be more on NAMA as well as on the other areas of the Doha agenda. And it clearly shows in the absence of services, no gains there, that you have a substantial part of the U.S. business community also sitting on the sidelines, and that's been important. Now, what we conclude from this, to go back, is that the Doha deal has to be topped up. It has to be more ambitious to encourage constituents to rally to the cause and to meet the needs, the ambition of having a development round. If you looked at the numbers of the distribution of the export of the GDP gains, you'll see the U.S., the EU, and China account for more than half of the total GDP gains that would accrue from the deal currently on the table. Small potatoes for us and very little for most of the developing countries in the WTO. So not a development round. That leads to the question, is the round worth saving? And there we still say yes. Both to harvest the gains from the tariff and subsidy reforms already on the table, and to lock in the trade facilitation commitments that Gary will talk about in a moment. The trade gains just on the table globally are over around $90 billion of increased exports and $90 billion in increased imports. This generates about over $60 billion in increased global GDP. That is not insignificant. It needs to be captured, but it will only be captured if the deal is completed. And it is important to emphasize that countries benefit from increased exports and increased imports. Trade flows in both directions contribute to GDP gains. Now, the round is also worth saving for systemic reasons. And in my talks around the world with ministers and trade ambassadors, I've come to the conclusion that they grossly underestimate the systemic risk of a failed Doha round. To ensure if the round continues to drift, I think countries will turn to even more to import barriers, subsidies to farmers and industry, and bilateral and regional trade pacts, and will be less inclined to go back to Geneva to try to solve their problems. The drift will thus cause irreparable harm to the WTO's credibility as a negotiating forum, which will certainly over time, if not sooner, undermine its valuable dispute settlement mechanism. So from that, what we say is Well, there is a way of making the round more ambitious and more balanced, and therefore more valuable to both developed and developing countries. Negotiators will certainly have to work out the details, but we looked at what could be achieved by topping up the existing offers. Overall, we found that additional liberalization could substantially enhance the value and attractiveness of the deal. Gary will now go into the details, but let me close our intro with three broad conclusions from our analysis of an enhanced package. First, services is a prerequisite for success. You have to have a component on services in the final package. Basically, you need the major trading nations to get together and request offer negotiations. About 15 to 20 countries. Most of them are in the G20. It could actually even be done through a G20 commitment to work together to contribute to the Doha Round. This would be a concrete result that G20 countries could do, probably not in Toronto this coming weekend, but by the time they get together in November in Seoul. But that's critical. Second, half of the, if you look at our results, even half of what we proposed would be more than twice as large as the deal that is currently on the table. And so while we may put forward ambitious objectives for the trade negotiators, even falling short of what we suggest would still be very valuable. And third, the results would yield larger gains for developing countries and justify the interest and intent of having the Doha Round contribute to growth in the developing world. So on that point, I think it's important to get into the details, and I will turn all the hard part over to Gary Hufbauer. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. The hard part was really done by Claire Brunel and Matt Adler and Woan Fong, who's here, and we're just going to report on it. But this was a huge effort and it burned out, I guess, two of our RAs, and Woan Fong is still standing. Well, let's turn to the agriculture first. Let me just say a little bit about the overall methodology. We used a partial equilibrium approach, which we realize is not state-of-the-art. Computable general equilibrium is the state-of-the-art. However, the advantage of the partial equilibrium approach and the way we set it out is this. It's extremely transparent. Computable general equilibrium models are generally understood by the people who make them and not many of the readers. You can walk through the tables, and we do have the full data set available for anybody who wants it, which show the tariff rates we used, or the tariff equivalent, and the subsidies, and the elasticities we imposed. And that's really the guts of any of these exercises, including the general equilibrium. So it's quite transparent. And I think interestingly, the main difference between the kind of results we come up with and what the World Bank comes up with using a CGE approach is, or their latest CGE approach, is some interesting theoretical work that Neary at Oxford did, which tries to devise weights at the 6-digit level, which would correspond to the importance of the products if they were not highly tariffed. And as I think most people in this room know, that if you use trade weights, which we do in our exercise, it understates the importance of products which have high tariffs because they don't have much trade. And therefore, we understate the gains that could be made in the tables we have. And in the book, you'll see some comparative results with the using the Neary approach through the World Bank's tables. Of course, they could only do it for NAMA and agriculture. Well, here's the story in agriculture. And the important part, which Jeff previewed, is the very sharp reduction in bound tariff rates in some developing countries. Now, we've only highlighted a couple of big developing countries, though we had 22 in our data set. And you can see, Brazil comes down by 10 percentage points and India by about 37 percentage points. China doesn't come down much because its bound rates are lower. That's what's on the table. The applied tariff rates don't come down very much in agriculture any place. A couple of percentage points except Japan, which makes a pretty substantial contribution on the table. In addition, of course, there are cuts in subsidies and enlargement of tariff rate quotas, and there's a box in the book which explains how Matt Adler worked this through to get the numbers. It's all kind of intricate, but in any event, the methodology is set out for those who are interested. Now, here are the gains that we calculate on the table in agriculture, both in trade gains, that is imports and exports, and in GDP gains. And incidentally, the GDP gains, which are sometimes called by economists welfare gains, and then that causes most people to think about child welfare and so forth, which is highly misleading. But GDP gains, they're not big in absolute terms. In fact, they're fractions of 1% for all countries which we looked at. But obviously, this is very important for the agricultural sector, and there are trade gains of some significance for agriculture, and this has been a major obstacle in the negotiations. But now, in terms of agriculture, we're pretty much down to how countries are going to deal with special products and the special safeguards mechanism, and some residual work on subsidies, particularly here and in the European community. So in our work, we don't try to top up in the agricultural area. There'll be some improvement, as I say, by limiting the extent of special safeguards, limiting the tariff lines which are excluded from duty-free, quota-free treatment, an area which Kim Elliott has worked on a lot, and cutting the subsidies. But in overall terms, that will not be big additional trade or GDP gains. Turning now to non-agricultural market access, this of course is about 90% of world trade. It's the big boy on the block, I guess. And again, now here we have, from most countries, bound tariffs and applied tariffs are closer, but that's not true for important emerging countries. And I guess that's what causes Frank Bargo indigestion, and why if he doesn't succeed, he'll have to find some other pursuit in life on this issue. Because you can see that while Brazil, for example, is coming down very sharply in bound tariffs in what's on the table, and India very sharply, the rates are still quite a bit above their applied tariffs. So as seen from a U.S. or European standpoint, or a Japanese standpoint, the actual liberalization is fairly limited. But there is some liberalization on the table. Unfortunately, in the case of India, it's kind of a fraction of 1%, and in Brazil, a little over 1%, and China doesn't want to contribute a whole lot either. But in any event, there is some liberalization, and given the volume of trade, it has a pretty big impact on trade, at least if you're taking trade gains compared to in the agricultural area, because the base numbers are much larger. So you can see the trade gains are pretty substantial. And when we come down to the sample countries, that's the 22 countries that Jeff mentioned, it's about 50 billion of exports and 45 of imports. Now, remember, the sample countries does not include all the other, 160 or 70 odd countries in the world. So always the numbers might be look a little bit odd, but we blow it up in the tables in the book, and you can find them there. Now, again, looking at GDP gains for major countries, it's not a big percentage of GDP, but it's substantially larger than what was happening in agriculture. And again, since you've got world GDP of about 70 trillion, you add it all up and it's pretty good for government work. A country that benefits a lot, clearly, is China. My view is that China is not contributing as much as it should to this whole negotiating effort, and they are a big beneficiary of the system as it now exists and of what is already on the table. Now, this is a very interesting measure because, of course, in this room, I guess maybe 98% of people are maybe free traders or understand the value of imports. When you get to Geneva, the fraction actually reverses. 98% of the people are of a mercantilist orientation, or they wouldn't have been designated as ambassadors in the first place. So imports are in their mind, or in the mind of people who have to do this negotiation, kind of a negative thing. And this reciprocity measure attempts to capture what's in the mind. I'm not saying it's a good measure for economists or kind of sensible people on the sidelines, but it does measure, bringing home the bacon. And what it attempts to measure is the value of tariff cuts applied to the base of trade on the import side and what the country gets on the export side. And then there's a fair amount of arithmetic which goes into dealing with subsidies and quotas, but you can imagine, imagine the way this would go, and it's certainly laid out in the book. And so total cuts given and received. Well, if we take just coming down to, let's say, Japan, it gives $3 billion worth of cuts in agriculture, and it gives $2.3 billion of cuts in non-agriculture. And it receives 0.5 in agriculture. Japan is not a big agricultural exporting country, but it has some specialty products. And it receives $6.2 billion in non-agricultural cuts on tariffs by its trading partners. So, probably if the Japanese trade negotiator can hold his agricultural community, or rather the ministry, in check, well, declare victory because he's getting more than he receives. So we think this is very interesting arithmetic. For most countries, it's relatively balanced, but of course, just turning up to Capitol Hill, you'll notice that the U.S. gives more than it receives. That's part of the imbalance of which Jeff was speaking earlier, and you can see the other imbalances earlier. I invite you to drop down to China, which, as I mentioned, has benefited hugely from the world trading system over the last 15 years, and is not contributing much to this round, at least not so far. And on the NAMA side of things, where China is a very big exporter, it's receiving much more than it's giving in this reciprocity measure on tariff cuts on its exports by comparison to its tariff cuts on its own imports. Now, services, which Jeff mentioned, well, they've not been fully engaged, and everyone knows that, even though about 70% of modern economies are service-oriented, and a good fraction of that is now tradable, as the work of our colleague Brad Jensen shows. Much more is tradable than is traded. And the failing, I guess, was to agree to defer serious talk on services until after NAMA and AG was concluded. Now, this is not a written agreement, it's an informal agreement, but at least many countries have insisted on that, which has postponed serious talk on services. We used some work, unpublished work, but it's cited there, of what a 10% cut in services barriers would mean. And now I want to turn to what I think is a very important chart, and that's the tariff equivalent to service barriers. As you can imagine, there's a hard area to quantify because services are not limited by tariffs. It's all non-tariff barriers. And there's a range of quantification, and we discuss that in the book. But these are the values that we thought were perhaps most representative, and they are very high. The non-tariff barriers to services trade are very high. They're right up there above agriculture in many cases. Big restrictions, with very few exceptions. Norway, big exception, so forth. But China, maybe this is too high, but it looks like about a 60% tariff equivalent, and that's even after we adjusted the numbers down from what one of the sources said they might be. Of course, U.S. and EU are fairly low, and Japan is moderate. But this is this is the future of the trading system in terms of growth or potential growth. We said that it would. Our modeling was to say, well, what about a 10% cut? That is, cutting, let's say, a 33.1% for Argentina down to 29.8%. Not a big cut. We didn't say how it would be done. There are so many areas where it could be done. And it's not just finance by any means. It's hospital management, it's education, it's electrical management, it's accounting, and so forth and so on, right across the board. And there are details in the book. So we put that in, and then we tried to say what would be the trade gains from this. And here's where the rebalancing comes. At least our estimates would suggest that the U.S. would have substantial gains in exports, as of course with the European Union. And on the import side, of course, China, India, Brazil, and other developing countries would have big gains on imports. Now here's where the mercantilism comes into effect and where our GDP story, how it plays out. Because to us, imports are good, which I realize is the opposite of thought amongst many trade negotiators. But most of these services are inputs to other sectors of the economy, and more services imports mean big reduction in costs and make those economies more efficient in total factor productivity terms. And that's a tremendous payoff to many countries, and that's where you get the additional gains, and that's where the development round comes to life or becomes a true development round, which I realize, again, just to repeat what I've said, is not the way that trade negotiators think about it. They unfortunately got in the mind of thinking that a development round meant we keep our barriers to imports as high as they are, and only the industrial countries lower their barriers to our exports. And they're missing a big part of the development that could come with that mode of thought. Now, we went on to 3 additional sectors for NAMA liberalization, and a lot of the Geneva talk is stalled over these and kind of what was said in Hong Kong and whether sectors are voluntary or part of the deal and so forth and so on. But our additional NAMA liberalization is quite modest. It's the 3 sectors that are identified above. There could be others, but these do seem the most likely if anything is done beyond what is on the table in NAMA today. So we took chemicals, where there's precedent from the Uruguay round negotiations, and we didn't say go all the way to 0, but cut the tariffs depending on their starting point to these numbers which are indicated there. Information technology, where there is a lot of precedent of going to 0, and then environmental goods. Environmental goods and services are part of the Doha agenda. We dropped out the services part. There's a huge resistance to services, environmental services, unfortunate, but that's the practicality. So we just focused on the goods. I was just in Geneva last week, and there's all this bickering back and forth on what is the appropriate list. Well, the World Bank has done a perfectly good list, and it could go forward on that basis, and that's what we modeled it on, and going to a 0% tariff. Many of these environmental goods are already very low tariffs, but going to 0%. And so this is our table, again, of gains if we take all these 3 sectors. The details of each of the 3 are spelled out in the book, but you can see, again, pretty big trade gains, and GDP gains are modest for some countries. For China, it'd be fairly big. For developing countries as a whole, it's a pretty big, percentage increase on a GDP side, pretty big imports because many of them have high restrictions on environmental goods. I'm not emphasizing the, the climate part of the debate, but that's an important thing which countries should welcome, and rhetorically they do welcome, but not in practice yet. That would, again, provide more balance. You can see the export-import balance for the U.S. and European Union if these items were put on the table. Let me now turn to trade facilitation. We're drawing near the end, you'll be happy to know. There's a lot of numbers here. Trade facilitation is really underappreciated in most circles. I mean, people give kind of rhetorical support for it, but it's underappreciated how important that is and how high the barriers are by way of trade facilitation. Our colleague Catherine Mann, together with John Wilson, who's now at the World Bank, was once here at the Institute, have done a lot of work on this, and we relied on their work to make our estimates. They focused on the items in the Doha talks, which are labeled there: port efficiency, services, infrastructure. The estimates were so high, and we realized that this tends to overlap with some of the other things we talked about on services, that we really just focused on the last two: customs and transparency. So what do we mean by that? And Fred challenged us to be quite concrete, so I will be very concrete. Customs. Let me talk about corruption first. The solution for corruption is for Hong Kong and Singapore to supply all the customs administration in the world. I mean, the corruption in customs administration is pervasive around the world. It's retail corruption. It's not the kind of stuff that happens in some countries today. I won't name them, but in the past, Suharto was quite famous for wholesale corruption. And this distinction has been made. That's not what customs is about. It's about retail corruption. And the way retail corruption works is you delay the clearance and cause a lot of hassle to the exporter, and finally he pays off, or his agent pays off. And that's the world today. It's very troublesome, and it could be corrected. Now, the way Mexico corrected, and some other countries, is just to fire all the existing customs officers and replace them with a new set, raise their pay, and then have a really effective internal inspection kind of system, auditing system. Well, and some countries have done that. That's what we're talking about in customs, on the corruption and transparency side of things. Pretty big stuff. Countries could agree to it in Doha. I mean, they could agree to, lower corruption. Everybody says they'll do that. But they might actually implement it over 10 years with some effort. What about the transparency part of the things, or administration? Well, here the concrete thing would be to have a single form around the world, or at least for these 22 countries, the big countries, which would deal with security issues, which are very heavy here in the United States on imports, would deal with phytosanitary safety issues as well as tariffs. Single form, electronically filed. There are platforms for this. They're not yet widely adopted, but they could be, and that would be a huge improvement. So if we did serious trade facilitation, just taking those two, the calculation we come to, which we think is fairly conservative, are these kind of trade gains. Pretty big. Now, why is the U.S. so big? Well, the U.S., we don't have great customs administration, or on the border. Talk with the Mexicans, talk with other countries who have to deal with our security procedures. And other countries, China, of course, has a lot of problems in its customs administration and so forth. But there are big numbers here if realized, and that's a part of our top-up. So now, conclusion. Well, came up with this very short list of what countries could do, at least the big players, to move things forward, and we think this is all within the realm of possibility. The farm subsidies for the U.S., the zeroing issue, add a few more percentage of tariff lines to DFQF, European Union, again, farm and more reform in services. Major developing countries agree on the sectors that we've just discussed, and trade facilitation actually make it work, and curb back the demands on SSM, the Special Safeguards Mechanism. And China should cut dramatically its already low NAMA rates, and Brazil and India could improve their offers. That's our conclusion. We think it's achievable. We realize the the mood right now is not so great, and I was a little discouraged to read the op-ed by Secretary Geithner and Larry Summers the other day I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, maybe in the Washington Post. But the thing about it was it did not mention trade. Did not mention trade. And all this other stuff, no mention of trade in this op-ed. Pretty discouraging. But hopefully somebody will pick it up and roll with it in the G20 and get things going. Thank you very much.